A shorter version of the information began to appear. It integrated itself into labels and daily routines. The full implications of this separation took years to become apparent. This was not an isolated event. At the time, this seemed like a minor formatting choice, a way to save space, a reasonable edit for clarity. But what got removed in that edit wasn't just extra words. It was context. It was the part that explained why something mattered, or what had been left out, or what the limitations were. The short version fit on a label. It fit in an advertisement. It fit in the amount of time someone had while standing in a store aisle. The long version required sitting down. It required reading. It required deciding that something was worth investigating beyond the surface. And most people didn't have time for that. This wasn't about intelligence. It wasn't about education. It was about the structure of daily life. People were moving faster. Households were busier. The amount of time available to evaluate a single purchase decision was shrinking, and the information environment adapted to that reality. The short version became the default. The long version became optional. And over time, the long version became something most people forgot even existed. This happened with ingredient lists, with nutritional panels, with studies, with policy documents, with the explanations behind why a formula changed, or why a practice shifted, or why something that had been done one way for decades was suddenly being done differently. The long version was technically available. It was filed somewhere. It could be requested. But requesting it required knowing it existed in the first place, and most people didn't. What this created was a gap. Not a gap in access exactly. The information was there, but a gap in awareness. A gap between what people assumed they knew and what they would have known if they'd had the time and the prompt to look further. And that gap grew slowly. It grew as the short version became shorter, as the summaries became more condensed, as the explanations were streamlined into single sentences, then into icons, then into implied assumptions that didn't need to be stated at all because everyone already understood what this type of product was supposed to be. Except they didn't always understand. They understood the category, they understood the brand, they understood the price point and the convenience and the packaging. But the specifics, the actual details of what had changed or what had been substituted or what the difference was between this version and the previous one, those details lived in the long version. And the long version wasn't part of the routine. Most people never noticed this shift at the time. It didn't feel like information was being hidden. It felt like information was being simplified. And simplification felt helpful. It felt like progress. It felt like companies were making things easier to understand, not harder. But what was actually happening was a reordering of priority. The short version prioritized what could be communicated quickly. And what could be communicated quickly wasn't always what mattered most. It was what fit, what sold, what reassured without requiring further explanation. The long version contained the caveats, the uncertainties, the parts that didn't sound as clean, the admissions that this was new or experimental or not yet fully understood, the acknowledgments that results varied or that some people responded differently, or that the science was still developing. Those parts didn't fit in the short version, so they were moved, filed, archived, made available upon request to anyone who thought to ask. But asking required suspicion, and most people didn't start out suspicious. They started out trusting that if something important had changed, they would have been told. And they were told, in the long version. This pattern wasn't limited to food. It appeared in medications, in household products, in environmental reports, in the documentation that came with new technologies, new materials, new methods of production. The short version explained what it did. The long version explained how it worked, what the risks were, and what was still unknown. The short version was designed for decision-making. The long version was designed for understanding. And over time, decision-making and understanding became two separate activities. People made decisions based on the short version. They assumed understanding would come if it was needed. But the threshold for needed kept rising. It wasn't needed unless something went wrong. It wasn't needed unless there was a reason to doubt. And for most people, most of the time, there wasn't a clear reason to doubt. The system functioned, products worked, life continued, and the long version remained filed away, unread, accumulating in archives that no one thought to search. This created a kind of structural ignorance, not ignorance in the sense of stupidity, ignorance in the sense of not knowing what you didn't know, of operating with incomplete information and not realizing it was incomplete because the gaps weren't visible. The short version didn't announce its own limitations. It didn't say, "This is a summary," or "For full details, see document B." It presented itself as complete, as sufficient, as everything you needed to know. And for practical purposes, it was sufficient. You could make a purchase, you could use a product, you could feed your family, you could live your life. The short version allowed all of that to happen. What it didn't allow was informed consent in the deeper sense, the sense where you understood not just what you were choosing, but what you were choosing between, what had been replaced, what the trade-offs were, what was gained and what was lost. That required the long version, and a long version required time, and time was the one thing the entire system was designed to save. So the trade-off became invisible. Convenience in exchange for context, speed in exchange for depth, efficiency in exchange for the kind of understanding that comes from sitting with information long enough to see what's missing. And what was missing accumulated over decades. Not in a single moment, not in a way that felt like a crisis, but in the slow drift between what people thought they knew and what was actually true, between what they assumed had been checked and what had been assumed by someone else somewhere earlier in the chain who also hadn't read the long version. The effects of this didn't appear immediately. For years, it worked. The system scaled. Products became cheaper, more available, more consistent. The short version told people what they needed to know to participate in that system, and participation felt like enough. But over time, patterns emerged. Patterns that didn't make sense based on the short version. Patterns that required looking deeper, that required asking why something that was supposed to be safe or healthy or equivalent to what came before was producing different outcomes. And when people started asking those questions, they found the long version, finally, years later, sometimes decades later. And in the long version, the answers had been there the entire time. Not hidden exactly, but separated, placed in a different document, a different format, a different level of accessibility, written in technical language that assumed a background most people didn't have, structured in a way that required knowing what to look for before you could find it. The long version had been designed for experts, for regulators, for researchers, for the small number of people whose job it was to read these things. Everyone else was expected to trust the short version, to trust that if something in the long version mattered, it would have been translated into the short version. But translation is interpretation, and interpretation involves choices. Choices about what to emphasize, what to minimize, and what to leave out entirely because it complicates the message or raises questions that don't have easy answers. Those choices weren't made maliciously, they were made practically, made by people trying to fit complex realities into simple frameworks, made under time pressure, under budget constraints, under the assumption that most people didn't want or need the full complexity. And that assumption was partly true. Most people didn't want complexity. They wanted clarity. They wanted to be able to make a decision and move on. But clarity and completeness are not the same thing, and the gap between them is where the problems lived. This wasn't about conspiracy. It wasn't about deliberate deception. It was about a system that optimized for one thing, efficiency of communication, and in doing so created a deficit in another thing, a deficit in shared understanding, in collective awareness of what had changed and why. The short version told people what to do. The long version told people what was happening, and increasingly, those were two different stories. By the time people realized the difference, the habits were already set. The infrastructure was built. The assumptions were embedded. The short version had become the truth, not because it was more accurate, but because it was more accessible, more repeated, more integrated into daily life. And the long version remained where it had always been, available, unread, waiting for someone to think it mattered enough to look. But the system that created the short version also created the conditions that made looking harder, that made people busier, more distracted, more dependent on summaries and shortcuts, and trusting that someone else had done the deeper work. And in many cases, someone had. But that work lived in the long version, and the long version wasn't designed to reach people. It was designed to exist, to be on file, to satisfy the requirement that the information had been disclosed. Disclosure is not the same as communication, and communication is not the same as understanding. The long version existed. It always existed. But existence alone doesn't create change, doesn't create awareness, doesn't close the gap between what people needed to know and what they actually knew. That gap wasn't an accident. It was a feature of a system designed to move quickly, to scale broadly, to function efficiently without requiring every person at every level to understand every detail. And for a long time, that worked, until it didn't, until the effects of not knowing started to show up in ways that couldn't be ignored, in patterns that couldn't be explained by the short version alone. And when people went looking for answers, they found that the long version had been there all along. It had just never been part of the conversation. Similar decisions followed, in other industries, other contexts, other moments where the choice was made to simplify, to streamline, to separate what people needed to know from what they might want to know if they had the time. And each time, the long version existed, filed away, waiting.